In 2007, private royal letters surfaced in the public record around the inquest into Princess Diana's death. They pulled the story back 15 years, to 1992, and to a correspondence most viewers were never meant to read, Diana writing to Prince Philip. No balcony, no speech, just paper. And the first shock is how warm they could sound. Diana could address Philip as, "Dearest Pa," not the language of a constitutional crisis, but of a daughter-in-law reaching toward a family elder. Yet those same letters later became part of the evidence people used to understand why Diana came to fear him. To be clear, this is not a story about a murder plot or physical threats hidden in royal stationery. It is a paper trail story about power. Inside the House of Windsor, a letter from Philip was never only a letter from Philip. It could carry the family's judgment, the palace's pressure, and the rules that decided who still belonged. The question is not simply whether Diana was afraid of this man, it is whether she feared what he represented. That is the hinge. Read the letters as a quarrel between two difficult personalities, and the frightening part disappears. Philip was Diana's father-in-law, but he was also the Queen's husband, father to the future king, and one of the few people inside the family who could speak in private language while carrying public consequence. So when a letter from Philip arrived, it crossed two worlds at once, the dinner table and the crown. Behind him sat the Queen, the line of succession, the palace press operation, the rules around royal status, and the fragile question of what happened to a princess who no longer fit neatly inside the system. That does not mean Philip had absolute power. It does not mean every word he wrote was an official command. The British monarchy rarely works that cleanly. Its power often moves through suggestion, pressure, access, silence, and family duty. That is why these letters matter. They show a private channel where family advice could become institutional discipline. To understand that channel, we have to look at Philip himself, not as a king, not as a cartoon villain, but as the household figure who had spent decades defending the monarchy from inside its own walls. Philip's power lived in a gray zone, not written into law, felt inside the household. He was not the sovereign, he was not king. Constitutionally, the crown belonged to Elizabeth, but by the time Diana's marriage was breaking apart, Philip had spent more than 40 years beside the monarch at ceremonies, tours, crises, and private family reckonings. He understood the monarchy as a machine that survived only when everyone inside it accepted discipline. That instinct came partly from his own life. Philip had been a naval officer. He had lived through exile, war, and the abrupt loss of childhood security. When he married Elizabeth, he entered an institution that gave him proximity to power but denied him the central title. So he built influence in the places available to him: the family table, household routine, private tone, and the expectations placed on children and spouses. Inside that world, bluntness was part of his authority. It could read as honesty. It could also land as judgment. And when the person delivering that judgment was the Queen's husband, Charles's father, and a senior guardian of royal continuity, it was never just one man's opinion. Philip did not need to command the government to make Diana feel institutional pressure. His authority came from proximity, to the Queen, to Charles, to the rules of royal belonging, and to the quiet decisions that shaped who was protected, supported, or left outside the circle. Diana had a different kind of power. She had cameras, crowds, and a public emotional connection the palace could not manufacture. But the palace still controlled legitimacy, titles, protocol, access to royal spaces, separation arrangements, and the public framing of whether she was a loyal princess or a destabilizing problem. So when Philip wrote, Diana received words from a man standing at the hinge between family disappointment and institutional consequence. In 1992, that hinge began to carry more weight than the palace could contain. In 1992, that hinge took the full weight of a royal marriage collapsing in public. 11 years earlier, Charles and Diana had been presented as the cleanest image of succession: the Prince of Wales, the young bride, the balcony, the carriage, the future secured in public view. By 1992, that image had cracked in front of the same public asked to believe in it. The pressure was visible long before the formal separation. The British press had tracked separate holidays, strained appearances, and every visible sign of distance. Then Andrew Morton's book, Diana: Her True Story, arrived in 1992 and pushed the crisis into a new category. It presented a devastating portrait of Diana's unhappiness, and although its sourcing was controversial at the time, its effect was immediate. The private pain of the Princess of Wales became a national argument about the future king. For the palace, this was not only a husband and wife failing to live together, this was the heir to the throne, the mother of the next heir, and two young princes inside a media storm that made the monarchy look less stable and less in control of its own story. For an institution built on continuity, embarrassment becomes risk when it starts threatening credibility. For the Windsors, 1992 was that moment. Separation had to be managed as a threat to succession optics, public credibility, and the idea that royal family life still represented national continuity. That is why Philip's pen mattered. Once the marriage became an institutional problem, a letter from him could operate as more than family counsel. It could carry the weight of the house trying to restore order. And the first letters began, surprisingly, in the language of family. In correspondence later discussed in official and biographical accounts, Diana is reported to have addressed Philip not as "Your Royal Highness," not as the Duke of Edinburgh, and not even as a distant father-in-law, but as Pa. That single word matters because it delays the easy reading. At first, this was not a formal summons from the palace machine. It still had the texture of a family conversation, painful, unequal, but personal. A woman whose marriage was collapsing was writing to the senior man in the family as someone who might listen, interpret, perhaps even help. Some accounts describe Philip's early role as an attempt at mediation. He was not simply issuing orders from the start. He appears to have been trying to understand what had gone wrong between Charles and Diana, press both sides toward some resolution, and keep the rupture from destroying the public face of the family. That does not make the relationship simple. Warm language inside the royal family could still carry hierarchy. Pa was intimate, but Philip was also Charles's father, the Queen's husband, and someone who understood what a royal separation could do to the institution. For Diana, answering him meant entering a narrow room with two doors. One door was family, a father-in-law, an elder, someone close enough to write to directly. The other was the crown, rules, reputation, duty, and the future of her sons, folded into the same exchange. If the correspondence had begun as pure hostility, the story would be easier to read and less revealing. Instead, it began in a form Diana could still engage with. She could call him Pa. She could answer. She could hope the person writing back was trying to mediate rather than discipline. That is why the shift in tone matters. Then, according to Diana's own circle, the room narrowed. Patrick Jepson, Diana's private secretary during this period, later described the later letters from Philip as a serious blow to her. Not because they read like threats of violence. The available evidence does not show that. The force came from somewhere else. Jepson's account presents them as increasingly critical, and Diana, he says, was deeply shaken. A critical letter from an ordinary father-in-law can wound. A critical letter from Prince Philip, in the middle of a royal separation, could feel like a ruling from the family court of the monarchy itself. The issue was no longer only whether Charles and Diana could repair a marriage. It was how Diana was expected to behave while the marriage failed, what she could say, how public she could be, whether she was seen as loyal, unstable, difficult, or dangerous to the institution. Inside the royal world, those labels could shape who was believed, protected, and kept fully inside the circle. So the same correspondence that once allowed Diana to write, "Dearest Pa," now carried a colder implication. Comply with the family's idea of order, or risk being defined against it. Philip's motives are still interpreted differently. Some see a stern elder trying to rescue a collapsing household. Others see a senior royal applying pressure to a vulnerable woman who had become a public problem for the crown. Whatever he intended, Diana's reported reaction tells us how the letters landed. They landed as power. The question becomes what kind of system his words allowed him to speak for. Here, the letters stop being only words on a page. A normal family letter can ask for patience, forgiveness, or restraint. But a letter from Prince Philip to Diana moved through a power map. On one side was Diana's public strength. She could walk into a hospital ward and change its atmosphere. She could draw cameras by stepping out of a car. She had emotional authority the monarchy could not manufacture, and by 1992, that made her both valuable and dangerous. Fame was not security. The crown still controlled the language of belonging, who was treated as fully royal, who had household access, who was briefed, who was protected by silence, who was presented as dignified, and who was allowed to become a problem. Separation touched titles, residences, money, staff, access to William and Harry, press strategy, and the public story of the future king. Philip did not control all of those levers by himself. That would be too simple, and the evidence does not support it. But he was close enough to the center, senior enough in the family, and blunt enough in style that his letters could carry the weight of the system around him. When Diana read criticism from Philip, she was reading more than the disappointment of a father-in-law. She was reading a warning about royal boundaries. Behave within them, and you may remain inside the protected story. Step outside them, and the institution can define you as unstable, disloyal, or unfit. The letters were private, but the consequences they pointed toward were public. They reached into Diana's status, credibility, place beside her sons, and the way history would explain the marriage's failure. This is what makes her fear legible without turning Philip into a cartoon villain. The frightening thing was not that one man had absolute power. It was that one man could write with the voice of a family that was also an institution. Once she believed private channels were being used to contain her, the next question was how she could answer in public. Containment can backfire. The palace wanted containment. Fewer leaks, fewer public shocks, fewer moments where the future king's marriage looked like a constitutional problem on the front page. Philip's letters fit inside that strategy. They were private pressure, delivered through family language, aimed at pulling Diana back within institutional rules. But pressure works only if the person receiving it still trusts the room it comes from. By 1995, Diana no longer seemed to believe the palace's private rooms could protect her version of the story. The separation was public, the press was relentless. Charles had given his own televised interview in 1994, acknowledging adultery after the marriage had, in his words, irretrievably broken down. Around Diana, advisors, journalists, friends, and palace officials were all competing to shape what the public would believe. So the conflict moved to a different arena, television. In November 1995, Diana sat down for the BBC's Panorama interview and spoke directly to millions of viewers. The ethics and circumstances of that interview later became their own serious controversy, especially after investigations into how it was obtained. But its impact at the time was immediate. A conflict managed through letters, briefings, courtiers, and controlled statements was now happening on television. The letters did not cause Panorama on their own. They were one strand in a larger collapse of trust. The failed marriage, the press war, the Morton book, Charles's interview, separation negotiations, and Diana's growing belief that palace systems were working against her, but they help explain why a private answer may have felt impossible. If the institution could define her behind closed doors, television offered a way to define herself in public. Royal conflict was no longer contained by palace gates. It could be fought through cameras, broadcast schedules, and a public audience large enough to rival the institution itself. This is what the paper trail leaves behind. They do not prove a secret plot. They do not show Philip as a cartoon villain, or Diana as someone simply frightened by a difficult father-in-law. The evidence points to something more specific, a senior palace figure using private family correspondence to restore order during a crisis the monarchy could no longer contain. For Diana, Philip was not only Pa, he was the Queen's husband, Charles's father, the household elder, and one of the clearest voices of royal discipline inside the family. When his letters became colder, more critical, and more institutional, they could feel like more than personal disapproval. They could feel like the crown entering the room. That was the fear. Not a physical threat, but consequence. Belonging, status, public legitimacy. The terms on which she could remain connected to the family that was also the state's most famous institution. The irony is that pressure meant to contain Diana helped teach her that private channels could not protect her. The palace tried to manage a rupture through letters, hierarchy, and silence. Diana answered by making the rupture visible. The paper trail leaves a quieter conclusion than the myths around it. Royal families do not only govern through laws and titles. Sometimes they govern through dinner tables, family loyalties, and letters that begin with affection, until the institution starts speaking through them. If you want more evidence-led stories from inside the monarchy, stay with Palace Scandals.